The wind on those plains had a voice, and it only ever whispered one word: death. It was the same word it whispered the day it took Sarah McKinley's husband, leaving her shackled to a life she never asked for, a life owned by a man she despised. Sarah heard that whisper every single morning as the sun cracked open the sky like a raw egg. But this morning, the whisper wasn't wind. It was a snarl. It wasn't a promise of death. It was the sound of it happening right now. Down in the sun-scorched arroyo that scarred the edge of her property, a pack of wild dogs had something cornered. Their eyes were chips of yellow glass, gleaming with a hunger that was terrifying to behold. But their prey wasn't a jackrabbit. It wasn't a deer. It was a boy. He was bleeding, cornered, but there was a fire in his dark eyes that refused to be put out. And in that one heart-stopping moment, Sarah McKinley was presented with a choice, sharp and deadly as a shard of flint. She could bolt the door and pretend she heard nothing. Or she could step into a story that wasn't hers, a story that would burn her entire world to the ground. She had no idea that the real monsters weren't the dogs with the slavering jaws. The real monster was sleeping off a whiskey binge 50 miles away, and he was on his way home. The homestead wasn't a home. It was a tombstone marking the grave of her dreams. Every weathered plank of the small cabin, every splintered rail of the corral seemed to groan under the weight of the vast, empty sky. For 2 years, since the fever had stolen her James, the silence had been a ringing in her ears, a constant reminder of what she'd lost and what she'd been left with. James's brother, Thomas. The law, in its infinite cruelty, had made her his ward, his property. Thomas was a man carved from the same harsh landscape as the thorny mesquite and the sun-baked rock. Where James had been kindness and laughter, Thomas was sharp angles and sharper words. He managed the small ranch they'd all built together, but he managed Sarah too. His ownership was as clear and undisputed as the brand on their cattle. She was an asset, a pair of hands to cook and mend, a warm body for cold nights when the whiskey wasn't enough. Her days were a gray, monotonous cycle of chores, each one punctuated by the dread of his heavy footfalls on the porch. But for 3 days there had been peace, a fragile, beautiful bubble of it. Thomas was gone, supposedly to fix a line of fence out on the western edge of their land. Sarah knew better. His repairs always ended in the dusty one-street town of Redemption, a place where a man's thirst for liquor and cheap company could be easily quenched. His absence was a breath of fresh air in a suffocating room. She moved about the cabin with an efficiency born of long practice. The sourdough starter, a living legacy from her mother, bubbled softly on the hearth. The smell of coffee, a luxury she only allowed herself when he was gone, filled the small space. Her hands, chapped and calloused, worked the dough for the week's bread. Each push, each fold, was a small act of rebellion, a quiet claiming of her own time, her own space. And it was in that stolen moment of peace that she heard it. At first it was just a faint, high-pitched yipping. Coyotes, maybe. But then it grew. It swelled into a chaotic symphony of snarls and frenzied barks. This wasn't a pack hunting for sport. This was the sound of a kill. The noise sliced through the morning stillness, raising the fine hairs on her arms. It was coming from the arroyo, the deep, dry ravine that cut through their property like an open wound. Curiosity, a trait Thomas had tried to beat out of her, stirred in her chest. Or maybe it was something else, a premonition, a faint tug on a thread of fate she didn't even know she was holding. Wiping her floured hands on her apron, she stepped out onto the porch. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky. She squinted, scanning the landscape, her hands shielding her eyes. The sounds grew louder, more desperate. And then she heard it, a cry, not an animal cry. It was human. A cold, tight knot of dread formed in her stomach. Whispers from town echoed in her mind. Comanche raids, fearful, hushed stories told over watered-down beer. But that wasn't the sound of a raid. The barking, that was wild dogs, the feral, half-starved descendants of abandoned pets and camp followers, meaner and more desperate than any wolf. Every instinct screamed at her. Go back inside. Bolt the door. This is not your fight. Thomas's voice, a ghost in her head, sneered at her. You'd get yourself killed for a stray cat, Sarah. Got no sense. But against her better judgment, against the deep, ingrained instinct for self-preservation, Sarah moved. She didn't go back inside. She went to the corner of the cabin and took the heavy Winchester rifle from its pegs. It had been James's pride and joy. Its stock was smooth and cool against her cheek, its weight familiar, comforting. She checked the load, her movements sure and steady, a testament to the lessons her father had insisted she learn long ago. In this land, a woman alone was a woman in peril. Her boots made little sound on the cracked earth as she walked towards the arroyo. Thorny brush clawed at her skirts. The sun beat down on her head. The barking was a frantic, terrifying chorus now. She reached the edge of the ravine and peered down, and the breath was stolen from her lungs. A pack of at least a dozen wild dogs, a motley collection of ribs and matted fur, had a boy cornered against the canyon wall. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, his body small and wiry. He was Native American, his skin the color of rich earth, his black hair long and unbound. He was bleeding from a nasty gash on his leg, a dark stain spreading on his buckskin leggings. In his hand, he clutched a broken branch, a pitiful defense against the slathering jaws that lunged and snapped at him. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, fierce, and filled not with the terror she expected, but with a defiant, untamable fire. He was a cornered wolf cub, ready to fight to his very last breath. The lead dog, a big, ugly brute with a scarred muzzle and one milky white eye, lunged. The boy swung his branch, connecting with a dull thud. But the dog was relentless. It was going to be over in seconds. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Run. Save yourself. It's not your problem. But she wasn't looking at a problem. She was looking at a child. And in that moment, something inside her, something that had been dormant for 2 long years, buried under a mountain of fear and submission, broke free. The rifle came up to her shoulder as if it had a will of its own. Its weight felt right, steady. She took a breath, sighted down the long barrel at the lead dog, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the air, a deafening explosion that echoed across the plains. The pack scattered in a panicked wave of fur and dust. The lead dog yelped, a crimson flower blooming on its shoulder, and it limped away, its bravado shattered. The others, their courage broken, followed, melting back into the landscape as quickly as they had appeared. Silence fell once more, heavy and absolute, broken only by the boy's ragged breathing and the ringing in Sarah's ears. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the 20 yards of dust and rock that separated them. The boy still on his feet, his small chest heaving. And Sarah, a lone woman with a smoking rifle, standing on the precipice of a decision that would change her life forever. The West had a way of testing a person, of stripping you down to your very core. Sarah McKinley was about to find out what she was truly made of. But what she didn't know was that this test wasn't just about her. It was about a secret buried for years, a secret Thomas would kill to keep hidden, and she had just kicked the hornet's nest. The echo of the gunshot faded, swallowed by the immense listening silence of the plains. The boy didn't move. He stood frozen, his dark eyes wide, fixed on Sarah. He was still clutching the broken branch, his knuckles white. He looked from her to the spot where the lead dog had fallen, then back to her. His gaze was unreadable, a mixture of shock, fear, and something else, a flicker of questioning disbelief. Sarah's own heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. The recoil of the Winchester still thrummed in her shoulder. What have I done? The question screamed in her mind. She hadn't just scared off some dogs. She had intervened. She had stepped into a world that was not hers, a world of ancient tribes and unspoken laws, a world that settlers like her were taught to fear. Thomas's words, laced with the casual cruelty she knew so well, echoed in her memory. The only good Injun is a dead Injun. He'd said it often, a vile mantra repeated in the saloons of redemption, and muttered under his breath when he saw a distant rider on the horizon. But the figure below her wasn't an abstract threat. He was a child, bleeding and alone. The fire of defiance in his eyes was slowly being replaced by the dawning realization of pain. He swayed on his feet, his face pale beneath his sun-darkened skin. The gash on his leg was deep, a ragged tear in the buckskin that oozed blood onto the thirsty ground. Are you all right? Sarah called out, her voice raspy and uncertain. It felt like a foolish question. Of course, he wasn't all right. The boy didn't answer. He just watched her, wary as a trapped animal. He started to take a shuffling step backward, hissing in pain as he put weight on his injured leg. He was going to try and run. "Wait!" Sarah shouted, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "Don't run! I won't hurt you!" To prove her point, she slowly lowered the heavy rifle, resting its butt on the ground. She held her empty hands out to her sides, a universal gesture of peace she prayed he would understand. He paused, his eyes darting from her face to the rifle and back again. He was weighing his options, his young mind racing. To him, she was a white woman, an intruder in his land, armed and dangerous. For all he knew, she was a greater threat than the dogs had been. Sarah knew she had to get down to him, but the side of the arroyo was steep, a treacherous slope of loose rock and crumbling earth. A fall would be disastrous. She began to inch her way down, her boots slipping, sending small cascades of pebbles skittering into the ravine. Each movement was deliberate, slow, meant to reassure him. "I have a homestead," she said, her voice steady now, gentle. "It's not far. I have bandages, medicine. I can help with that leg." He remained silent, his gaze unwavering. As she got closer, she could see the details of his face, the high cheekbones, the strong line of his jaw, so serious for one so young. His hair was thick and glossy black, adorned with a single hawk feather tied with a strip of leather. His clothes were simple but well made, the buckskin soft and supple, decorated with intricate quill work she couldn't decipher. He was clearly not some outcast. He belonged to a people, a family that was probably out looking for him right now. When she was finally on the floor of the arroyo, she stopped about 10 feet away from him, giving him space. The metallic scent of his blood was sharp in the hot, still air. "My name is Sarah," she offered softly. The boy's eyes narrowed slightly at the sound of her name. He said nothing, but he didn't try to back away again. He was studying her, his intelligence keen and assessing. Sarah took a cautious step closer. "Let me see your leg," she said, her tone the one she used for skittish foals. He flinched as she moved, his hand tightening on his stick. "I just want to look," she reassured him. "I promise." Slowly, hesitantly, he seemed to make a decision. His shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, slumped slightly. He let the broken branch fall from his hand with a soft thud. He was exhausted, in pain, and utterly alone. He had no other choice. Sarah knelt before him, her skirts pooling in the dust. The gash was worse than she had thought. It was deep, torn by the dog's teeth, and filled with dirt and grime. It needed to be cleaned, and soon, or infection would set in. The plains were unforgiving, and a wound like this could easily turn deadly. "This is bad," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "We need to get you back to the cabin." She looked up at his face. For the first time, she saw not just defiance, but a profound weariness, a vulnerability that clutched at her heart. He was just a boy. "Can you walk?" she asked. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Sarah's mind raced. The homestead was a good half-mile away, across rough, uneven terrain. She couldn't possibly carry him, and leaving him here to go for help was out of the question. The dogs could come back, or worse. "All right," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. "We'll do this together." She stood up and turned her back to him, kneeling down. "Get on my back." He hesitated. The concept was clearly foreign to him. He stared at her back, then at the rifle lying on the ground. "It's all right," she urged, looking over her shoulder. "It's the only way." After a long moment, he moved. Awkwardly, painfully, he draped his arms around her neck. Sarah gritted her teeth as his weight settled on her. He was light, wiry, but he was still a dead weight. She hooked her arms under his legs, her fingers brushing against the soft buckskin. "Hold on tight," she instructed. With a grunt of effort, she pushed herself to her feet. The boy let out a sharp cry of pain as his injured leg was jostled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The journey back was in agony. The sun was relentless. The rifle was an awkward, heavy burden in one hand. The boy's weight seemed to double with every step. Her muscles screamed in protest and sweat stung her eyes, blurring her vision. The world narrowed to the next footstep, the next patch of thorny scrub to be navigated. The boy was silent, his breath hot on her neck. A few times she felt his grip tighten, a silent acknowledgement of a particularly rough patch of ground. They were a strange, desperate sight, a lone white woman carrying a wounded Native American boy across a landscape that was hostile to them both. With every step, Sarah felt the enormity of what she was doing pressing down on her. This was not a simple act of mercy, it was an act of rebellion. She was defying Thomas, defying the unwritten rules of the frontier, defying the fear that had governed her life for so long. As the familiar shape of her small cabin finally came into view, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. She stumbled the last few yards, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She practically fell through the doorway, gently lowering the boy onto the cot in the corner, the one James had built. He lay there, his eyes closed, his face a mask of pain. The fire she had seen in the arroyo was banked now, a mere ember. Sarah stood over him, her body trembling with exhaustion. She looked at the boy, then around the small, quiet cabin. The bubble of her peaceful morning had been shattered. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of this stranger, this child from another world. A world that was about to collide with hers in a way she could never have foreseen. The consequences of her actions were no longer an abstract fear. They were lying on the cot in her home, breathing her air, and they were waiting. The real drama she was about to find out had only just begun. The first hours were a blur of focused, desperate activity. Sarah shoved the heavy cabin door shut, sliding the thick wooden bolt into place. The sound, usually a comfort, now felt like a declaration. She was shutting the world out, or perhaps locking a new, dangerous world in. Her first priority was the boy's wound. She stoked the fire in the hearth, her movements swift and sure. Water, precious and hauled by hand from the well, was set to boil in a blackened kettle. While it heated, she rummaged through the small wooden chest where she kept her medical supplies, clean linen torn from old sheets, a small sharp knife, and a jar of a pungent dark salve her mother had taught her to make from comfrey and yarrow. It was a homesteader's remedy meant for rope burns and minor cuts, but it would have to do. The boy watched her every move, his dark eyes missing nothing. He lay on the cot perfectly still, a statue of stoic endurance. He had not uttered a single word since she found him. Not a cry of pain, not a whisper of thanks. His silence was a wall, and Sarah didn't know how to breach it. "I need to clean this," she said, her voice soft as she approached the cot with a basin of hot water and a cloth. "It will hurt." He simply stared at her, his jaw set. She took his silence as consent. Gently, she began to cut away the blood-stiffened buckskin around the gash. The fabric was tough, and her hands trembled slightly. As the full extent of the wound was revealed, a wave of nausea washed over her. It was deep, ragged, and inflamed. The dog's teeth had torn muscle, and the edges were already red and swollen. She dipped the cloth in the hot water, wringing it out. "Brace yourself," she whispered. The moment the hot cloth touched his skin, he flinched violently, his body going rigid. A sharp hiss of breath escaped his lips, the first sound he had made. But he did not cry out. His eyes squeezed shut, and the muscles in his neck corded with the effort of bearing the pain. Sarah's heart ached for him. She worked as quickly and as gently as she could, cleaning away the dirt and grime, her touch methodical. She tried to imagine what he had been through, alone and facing down a pack of starving dogs. The courage it must have taken. Once the wound was as clean as she could get it, she applied the salve. The boy's eyes flew open as the cool ointment touched his feverish skin. He watched her, his gaze intense, as she carefully wrapped the leg in clean linen bandages. When she was finished, she pulled a blanket over him. His skin was hot to the touch. A fever was setting in. "You need to drink," she said, holding a dipper of cool water to his lips. He looked at the dipper, then at her face. For a moment she thought he would refuse, but then, slowly, he parted his lips and allowed her to trickle a little water into his mouth. He drank thirstily, his Adam's apple bobbing. For the rest of the day, a strange, unspoken truce settled over the small cabin. Sarah went about her chores, her movements quiet and deliberate. She baked the bread she had started that morning, the familiar, comforting scent filling the air. She fed her handful of chickens and milked the lone cow, her mind a whirlwind of anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the walls, sent a jolt of fear through her. She was constantly glancing at the door, expecting to see Thomas's imposing figure filling the frame. What would he do if he found the boy here? The possibilities were too horrific to contemplate. Thomas, with his simmering resentment and his deep-seated hatred of Native Americans, would not see a wounded child. He would see an enemy, an intruder, a threat to be eliminated. The boy drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Sometimes he would murmur in a language she didn't understand, his brow furrowed in pain. In his waking moments, he would simply watch her, his silence a heavy, unnerving presence. Who was he? Where was his family? Were they looking for him? These questions churned in Sarah's mind. She scanned the plains from the small cabin window, half expecting to see a war party descending on her homestead, seeking vengeance for their missing son. But the landscape remained stubbornly empty, the horizon shimmering in the heat. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the boy woke. His fever seemed to have broken slightly. He looked more alert, his gaze clearer. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his eyes falling on the rifle which Sarah had leaned against the wall near the hearth. He gestured towards it with his chin. Sarah followed his gaze. "It was my husband's," she said softly. "His name was James." She didn't know why she told him that. Perhaps it was the silence, the need to fill it with something other than her own fear. The boy's eyes moved from the rifle to her face. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he spoke. His voice was quiet, raspy from disuse. "Kim," he said. Sarah blinked. "I'm sorry?" He pointed a finger at his own chest. "Kim." It was his name. He was telling her his name. A small crack in the wall of silence. "Kim," she repeated, the sound strange on her tongue. A wave of emotion so strong it almost brought her to tears washed over her. It was a fragile bridge, this one shared word, but it was a bridge nonetheless. She offered him a small, hesitant smile. "My name is Sarah." He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He had heard her the first time. Just then, a sound from outside shattered the quiet moment. The sound of a horse moving at a steady, familiar pace. Sarah's blood ran cold. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic, trapped bird. It was Thomas. He was back. A day early. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She looked at Kim, his eyes wide with alarm. He had heard it too. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was about to be broken. She had to hide him. But where? The cabin was one small room. There was nowhere to go. The horse's whinny was closer now, just outside the corral. Heavy boots hit the ground. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, were approaching the cabin door. "Get under the cot," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with terror. "Quickly!" Kiem, understanding the urgency in her tone, moved without question. He slid off the cot and squeezed himself into the dark space beneath it, pulling the edge of the blanket down to conceal himself just as the heavy wooden bolt on the door screeched as it was lifted from the outside. Sarah stood in the middle of the room, her hands clenched at her sides, her body trembling. She tried to compose her face, to erase the fear and anxiety she knew were written all over it. The door swung open, and Thomas McKinley filled the doorway. His broad frame blocked out the last of the fading light. His face, shadowed by the brim of his dusty hat, was set in a thunderous scowl. He reeked of whiskey and stale sweat. His eyes, small and hard, swept the room, and Sarah knew with a sickening certainty that her life was about to unravel. Thomas stood there for a moment, a hulking silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. He took in the scene with a slow, proprietary gaze. The single room, the neatly swept floor, the simmering pot on the hearth, and finally Sarah. His eyes narrowed, suspicion already clouding his features. "You're quiet tonight," he rumbled, his voice thick with trail dust and cheap whiskey. He kicked the door shut behind him, the sound echoing the slam of a cell door. "I didn't expect you back so soon," Sarah said, her voice commendably steady, despite the frantic fluttering in her chest. She busied herself at the stove, her back to him, praying he wouldn't see the tremor in her hands. "Got my business done early," he grunted, shrugging off his heavy duster and tossing it onto a chair. He walked over to the wash basin, splashing his face with water, the sound harsh in the tense silence. "That fence was worse than I thought. Damned Apache's been cutting the wires again, I reckon." Sarah said nothing. She knew it was a lie. There hadn't been any real trouble with the local tribes in years. It was just a convenient excuse, a way for him to justify his absences and fuel his own simmering hatred. He dried his face on a rough towel, his eyes scanning the room again. They lingered on the cot in the corner. "What's this?" he asked, his voice sharp. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What's what, Thomas?" "The cot. It's been slept in." He walked over to it, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. Every step was a hammer blow to Sarah's nerves. From her peripheral vision, she saw him poke at the blanket with the toe of his boot. Beneath it, she knew Keem was holding his breath, perfectly still. "I was feeling tired this afternoon," she improvised, her voice a little too high. "I lay down for a spell." Thomas grunted, not entirely convinced. He was a man who noticed things, small changes in his environment. It was part of what made him so intimidating. His gaze fell on the small pile of bloodied and torn buckskin she had hastily shoved into the kindling box next to the hearth. He hadn't noticed it yet, but it was a ticking bomb. "Smells different in here," he said, sniffing the air. "Like herbs or something." "I was making a poultice," Sarah said quickly, "for my hands. They're chapped." It was a weak lie, and she knew it. Thomas turned to face her, his eyes pinning her in place. He was closer now, and the stale smell of liquor on his breath was overpowering. "You're jumpy, Sarah. What's wrong with you?" "Nothing," she insisted, turning back to the stew, stirring it with a wooden spoon she didn't need to stir. "I'm just tired." He was silent for a long moment, studying her back. The silence stretched thin and taut, ready to snap. She could feel his suspicion growing, coiling in the small space between them. Then his eyes fell on the basin of water she'd used to clean Kim's wound. It was still on the small table next to the cot, and the water was tinged a dirty, pinkish red. "What's this water for?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Before Sarah could answer, he strode over to it. He dipped his fingers in, then rubbed them together, a dark look crossing his face. He looked from the water to her, then back to the cot, and then he saw it. A single dark drop of blood on the floorboards near the edge of the blanket, a drop she had missed in her panicked haste. His face transformed. The suspicion hardened into a cold, ugly certainty. "What have you done?" he snarled. He moved with a sudden, shocking speed. He kicked the small table over, sending the basin crashing to the floor. Then he lunged for the cot, ripping the blanket away with a single violent motion. A collective gasp filled the room. Sarah's a gasp of terror. Thomas's a gasp of furious disbelief. And from under the cot, the sharp, startled intake of breath from Kim. The boy lay curled in the small space, his eyes wide with fear, blinking in the sudden lamplight. He looked small, vulnerable, and utterly out of place. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Then Thomas let out a roar of pure, unadulterated rage. "An engine!" he bellowed, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "You brought an engine into my house!" He lunged for the boy, his big hands reaching. Sarah reacted on pure instinct. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, its handle still warm, and swung it with all her might. "No!" she screamed. The skillet connected with the back of Thomas's head with a sickening thud. He grunted, staggering forward, more surprised than hurt. He turned on her, his eyes blazing with a murderous light. "You crazy bitch!" he roared and backhanded her across the face. The blow sent her sprawling to the floor, her head cracking against the leg of the table. Stars exploded behind her eyes and the taste of blood filled her mouth. Thomas turned his attention back to Kim. He dragged the boy out from under the cot, shaking him like a rag doll. Kim cried out, a sharp yelp of pain as his injured leg was jostled. Where'd you come from, you little savage? Thomas spat, his face inches from Kim's. You a scout for a war party, huh? Kim, terrified, just stared at him, his body trembling. Dazed, Sarah pushed herself up. The room was spinning. Through the haze of pain, she saw Thomas dragging Kim toward the door. I'm going to string you up from the nearest tree, Thomas snarled. A message to the rest of your kind. A primal fear, a fear for the boy's life, cut through Sarah's pain. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. The rifle. It was still propped against the wall by the hearth. As Thomas fumbled with the bolt on the door, his back to her, Sarah lunged for the Winchester. Her fingers closed around the cool, smooth wood of the stock. It felt heavy, solid, an extension of her own desperate will. She cocked the rifle. The click-clack of the action was deafeningly loud in the small cabin. Thomas froze. He turned around slowly, his hand still on Kayem's arm. His eyes widened when he saw the rifle in her hands, the barrel aimed squarely at his chest. Sarah, he said, his voice dangerously soft, put the gun down. Let the boy go, Thomas, she said, her voice shaking but resolute. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. You wouldn't, he sneered. You don't have the guts. Try me, she whispered, her finger tightening on the trigger. They stood there, locked in a deadly standoff. The woman who had been his meek, submissive sister-in-law was gone. In her place was a stranger, a woman with murder in her eyes. And between them, a wounded boy who had become the catalyst for a storm that had been brewing for 2 long years. Outside, the wind began to howl, rattling the windows of the small cabin. It sounded like a lament, a mournful cry for what was about to happen. The bubble of Sarah's world hadn't just been shattered, it had exploded, and the fallout was just beginning. The standoff in the cabin stretched for an eternity, each second thick with unspoken threats. The fire crackled, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls, turning the small room into a theater of menace. Thomas's sneer remained fixed, but a flicker of uncertainty had entered his eyes. He had pushed Sarah for years, testing the limits of her endurance, but he had never seen this woman before. This cold-eyed stranger holding his life in her hands. He's just a boy, Thomas, Sarah said, her voice low and steady, belying the violent trembling of her body. He was hurt. The dogs would have killed him. He's a savage, Thomas spat, his grip on Kim's arm tightening, making the boy wince. They're all the same. They'd kill us in our sleep for the salt in our larder. You don't know that, Sarah shot back. You don't know anything about him. I know his kind. Thomas's gaze was venomous. And I know you, Sarah. You're weak, soft-hearted. You'd shelter a rattlesnake if it was shivering. Now put that damn rifle down before you do something you'll regret. He took a small step forward, a calculated move to test her resolve. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, the cold metal a stark reality against her skin. One more step, she warned, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I swear to God, Thomas, I will shoot you. The raw conviction in her tone gave him pause. He stopped, his eyes darting between her face and the unwavering barrel of the Winchester. He was beginning to believe her, and it was in that moment of frozen tension that a new sound intruded, cutting through the howling of the wind, a sound that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand on end. It was the rhythmic, percussive beat of multiple horses approaching at a steady, deliberate pace. Not the sound of a lone rider or a rambling buckboard. This was organized, purposeful. Thomas heard it too. His head snapped up, a look of alarm replacing the angry sneer. He glanced towards the window, then back at Sarah, a new dawning fear in his eyes. Who is that? He hissed. Sarah didn't answer. She knew. A cold dread, far deeper and more profound than her fear of Thomas, washed over her. They had come. Kiem's people were here. Kiem, who had been a silent, terrified pawn in their struggle, now reacted. A look of recognition, of hope, flashed across his face. He let out a single high-pitched call, a sound that was both a cry for help and a signal. Outside, the sound of the horses stopped. There was a moment of profound silence, even the wind seeming to hold its breath. Then a voice called out, speaking in the same language Kiem had murmured in his fever. The words were incomprehensible to Sarah and Thomas, but the tone was clear. It was a question, a demand. Thomas's face went pale. The reality of their situation crashed down on him. They were isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor, and a party of Native American riders was outside their door. He was no longer the master of his small, violent kingdom. He was a trapped man. He shoved Kiem away from him, the boy stumbling against a chair. Thomas's bravado evaporated, replaced by a frantic, cornered animal fear. "This is your fault," he snarled at Sarah, his voice a panicked whisper. "You brought them here." The voice from outside called out again, louder this time, more insistent. "What do they want?" Thomas whispered, looking at the door, as if he expected it to be smashed in at any moment. Sarah lowered the rifle slightly, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by the need to think, to control the spiraling chaos. "They want the boy," she said simply. She looked at Kiem, who was now staring at the door, his expression a mixture of relief and anxiety. He looked back at her, and in his eyes she saw a silent plea. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made a decision. She walked to the door, the heavy rifle still in her hand. "What are you doing?" Thomas hissed, backing away toward the fireplace, his eyes wide with terror. "They're not going to go away, Thomas," she said, her voice calm. "Hiding in here will only make it worse." She leaned the Winchester against the wall by the door, a deliberate gesture. Then she took a deep breath, lifted the heavy bolt, and pulled the door open. The sight that greeted her made her gasp. At least a dozen riders were arranged in a silent, menacing semicircle in front of the cabin. They were mounted on strong, lean ponies that shifted restlessly in the wind. These were not the destitute, reservation-bound people she had seen on the fringes of redemption. These were warriors. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering lantern light spilling from the cabin, were grim and unsmiling. They were armed with bows, lances, and rifles, and their eyes were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. In the center of the group sat a man who was clearly their leader. He was older than the others, his face a mask of deeply etched lines, his long gray-streaked hair braided with eagle feathers. His presence radiated an aura of immense authority and a profound, weary sadness. He looked past Sarah, his eyes finding Kiem, and a flicker of emotion, of profound relief, crossed his stern features. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant, the words rolling like thunder. He was not speaking to her, but to Kiem. Kiem answered, his voice small but clear. He spoke rapidly, gesturing with his hands, his eyes darting from the leader to Sarah to Thomas, who was cowering near the hearth. The leader listened impassively, his gaze never leaving the interior of the cabin. As Kiem spoke, the man's eyes fell on the overturned basin, the blood-tinged water, the discarded blood-soaked bandages. He saw the angry red mark on Sarah's face where Thomas had struck her. His gaze then shifted to Thomas, and his eyes, dark and piercing, narrowed with a cold, dangerous light. When Kiem finished, the leader was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He looked at Sarah, a long, assessing gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of her fear and see the truth of what had happened. He saw the rifle she had leaned against the wall and understood its significance. Finally he spoke again, this time to one of the younger warriors beside him. The warrior dismounted and came forward. He was leading a pony, a beautiful creature with a coat the color of honey. Tied to the pony's saddle were several bundles wrapped in buffalo hide, and draped across its back were two stunningly beautiful, intricately woven blankets. The warrior led the pony to the cabin door and stopped, holding the reins out towards Sarah. Sarah stared, confused. She looked from the warrior to the pony, to the bundles, to the impassive face of the leader. What was happening? Was this some kind of trap? Thomas, seeing the pony and the goods, let out a shaky, relieved laugh. "They're trading," he whispered, a greedy light coming into his eyes. "They're trading for the boy." He saw the situation not as a delicate negotiation, but as a transaction, one from which he could profit. But Sarah knew he was wrong. This wasn't a trade. The solemnity of the leader's expression, the ceremonial way the pony was presented, it felt like something else entirely. Something ancient and profound that she couldn't begin to understand. The warrior grunted, thrusting the reins more insistently towards her. Hesitantly, Sarah reached out and took them. The leather was soft and worn, the pony's breath warm on her hand. The leader spoke one final time, his voice echoing in the sudden stillness. He looked directly at Sarah, his gaze unwavering, and then, with a curt nod, he turned his horse. The other warriors followed suit, melting back into the darkness as silently and suddenly as they had appeared. All except one. Kim's father, for Sarah now understood this must be him, waited. Kim limped out of the cabin, his eyes finding Sarah's for a brief, intense moment. A silent communication passed between them, of gratitude, of understanding, of farewell. He then went to his father, who helped him onto the back of his horse, and then they too were gone, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway of her cabin, holding the reins of a pony laden with mysterious gifts, the wind whipping her hair around her face. The storm had passed, but as Sarah looked at the offerings, a new bewildering mystery had just begun. This wasn't just a gift, it was something more, and a small, terrifying thought began to form in her mind. This wasn't a thank you, it was a payment. But for what? The wind howled, a lonely counterpoint to the deafening silence left by the departing riders. Sarah stood frozen in the open doorway, the leather reins of the honey-colored pony still clutched in her hand. The animal shifted its weight, its soft nose nuzzling against her arm, a startlingly real sensation in a moment that felt like a dream. Inside the cabin, Thomas finally seemed to regain his nerve, the immediate threat having vanished into the night. The greedy light returned to his eyes as he scrambled forward, his fear replaced by avarice. "What is it? What did they leave?" he demanded, his voice raspy. He reached for the bundles tied to the saddle, his fingers scrabbling at the leather knots. "Thomas, stop," Sarah said, her voice distant. She was still trying to process the silent, powerful exchange that had just taken place. "Stop! Are you crazy?" he sneered, pulling one of the smaller bundles free. "This is a windfall, Sarah. Payment for the boy. We should have asked for more. Rifles, maybe." He tore at the hide wrapping, revealing a collection of exquisitely tanned beaver and fox pelts, their fur thick and lustrous in the lantern light. A low whistle escaped his lips. "This is worth a fortune in redemption." He moved to the next bundle, this one larger and heavier. Inside were beaded moccasins, a quiver of arrows tipped with obsidian, and a magnificent ceremonial pipe carved from a dark, polished stone. But it was the last two items that made even Thomas fall silent. Two heavy bracelets of hammered silver, inlaid with turquoise stones the color of a summer sky. "My God," he breathed, holding them up. The silver gleamed, caught and pure. This is real wealth." But Sarah wasn't looking at the silver or the furs. Her eyes were fixed on the two blankets draped over the pony's back. They were woven with a skill she had never seen before. The patterns, intricate and symbolic geometric shapes, and figures of horses and eagles intertwined in a stunning tapestry of red, black, and white, were works of art, imbued with a sense of significance that went far beyond mere decoration. "This isn't a trade," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course it's a trade," Thomas scoffed, his good mood restored by the treasure trove at his feet. "They got their boy back. We get paid. It's the way of the world, even for savages." He clapped his hands together, rubbing them in satisfaction. "We'll take this to redemption tomorrow. Old man Hemlock at the trading post will give us a pretty penny for this lot. We'll be comfortable for a year, Sarah. Maybe more." He was already planning how to spend the money, how to turn this night of terror into a long binge of whiskey and gambling. But Sarah felt a growing unease, a cold dread that had nothing to do with Thomas or the violence that had transpired. It was the solemnity of the leader, the gravity of his gaze, the ceremonial nature of the gift. It felt binding. Her eyes fell on the pony itself. It was a fine animal, young and strong with a gentle disposition. It wasn't a workhorse. It was a riding pony, a personal mount, and it had been left for her. "They left the horse," she stated, the obvious fact suddenly hitting her with immense weight. "A bonus," Thomas declared magnanimously. "You can have the horse, Sarah. I'll take the rest." It was then that the full, terrifying meaning of the exchange began to dawn on her. She remembered stories she'd heard, fragments of conversations between old trappers and traders, whispers about the customs of the Plains tribes, customs that white settlers dismissed as barbaric or nonsensical. She remembered talk of alliances, of treaties sealed not with paper, but with gifts. And she remembered the term, spoken in a low, almost mythical tone, bride price, a payment made by a groom's family to the family of the bride, an offering to compensate for the loss of a daughter, to honor her family and to seal a union. They hadn't been paying for the boy's return. They were paying for her. The blood drained from her face. "Thomas," she said, her voice trembling, "this isn't payment for saving him. This is something else." "What are you babbling about?" he grumbled, stuffing the furs back into the hide wrapping. "The blankets," she said, her voice shaking as she reached out to touch the woven fabric. "The pony, the silver. This is a bride price." Thomas froze, his hands full of pelts. He slowly straightened up, a look of utter incomprehension on his face. He stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "A what?" "A bride price," she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. They think, they think you are my father, or my brother, my guardian. They saw you strike me. They saw that I defied you to protect their son. In their eyes I have no husband. I am unmarried. By saving their son, by showing courage, I have proven myself worthy. And by accepting these gifts, my guardian, you have agreed to a marriage." Thomas stared at her, then at the pile of goods, then back at her. A slow, dawning horror was followed by a burst of incredulous, barking laughter. "A bride price? You think they want you to marry one of them? A filthy Injun?" He laughed so hard he had to lean against the doorframe, tears welling in his eyes. "Sarah, you've finally gone mad. The fear has scrambled your brains." "Think about it, Thomas," she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate urgency. "Why else this formality? Why this specific collection of gifts? Furs for wealth, blankets for the home, a pony for the bride to ride to her new life. This is their way. They have bought me from you." The laughter died in Thomas's throat. He looked at the gifts again, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The sheer value of it was staggering. It was far more than a simple thank you gift. He looked at Sarah's pale, earnest face, and for the first time he considered the terrifying possibility that she might be right. The idea was so outlandish, so alien to his way of thinking, that he couldn't fully grasp it. But a seed of unease had been planted. "So what if you are right?" he said slowly, a cunning, calculating look entering his eyes. His mind, always attuned to opportunity, was already working, twisting this bizarre turn of events to his advantage. "What does it matter? They're gone. We have the goods. End of story." "You don't understand," Sarah pleaded. "This is a binding agreement to them. It's a matter of honor. They will be back. They will come back for me, for the bride." Thomas's face hardened. He looked from Sarah to the wealth on the floor. He had no intention of giving it up. But the thought of a dozen grim-faced warriors returning, not with gifts but with weapons, sent a chill down his spine. He was caught between his greed and his fear. And when Thomas was caught, he became even more dangerous. "Then we have a problem," he said, his voice low and menacing. He took a step towards her, his eyes cold. "But it's a problem of your making, Sarah. You brought that brat here. You started this, so you will finish it." He saw the situation with a sudden, terrible clarity. He had the gifts. He had been acknowledged in their strange way as her guardian, the man with the power to give her away, the power he had always felt he deserved. And now he saw a way to solidify that power, to get rid of the threat of the returning warriors, and to get rid of the troublesome woman who had defied him with a rifle just an hour before. "They want a bride," he said, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. "Fine. We'll give them a bride." Sarah stared at him, her heart turning to ice. She finally understood. He wasn't going to return the gifts. He wasn't going to try and explain the misunderstanding. He was going to accept the deal. He was going to sell her. The full, horrifying weight of her situation crashed down upon her. She had escaped the dogs in the arroyo. She had faced down her abuser. She had saved a child's life, only to find herself trapped in a new, more terrifying cage. A cage built of honor, tradition, and a brutal cultural misunderstanding. She was no longer just a widow on a lonely homestead. She was a commodity, a bride, bought and paid for. And her new life, a life she could not even begin to imagine, was waiting for her out there in the vast, dark heart of the West. The next day dawned gray and cold, a cruel irony on the plains that were so often baked in merciless sun. The treasures, the furs, the silver, the blankets, lay piled in a corner of the cabin, a glittering hoard that felt to Sarah like a pile of shackles. Thomas was in high spirits, humming a tuneless, drunken ditty as he moved about, already a wealthy man in his own mind. He was treating her differently now, not with the usual simmering contempt, but with the detached air of a rancher examining livestock he was about to sell. "They'll be back," he said, looking out the window, scanning the horizon. "Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. They'll give us time to prepare the bride." He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You can't do this, Thomas," Sarah said, her voice a hoarse whisper. She had barely slept, her mind racing through impossible escape scenarios. "I can and I will," he replied, not even looking at her. "You brought this on yourself. Besides, it's a good deal. We get all this," he gestured to the pile, "and I get rid of a nagging woman. Who knows, maybe you'll like it. They say the chiefs have many horses." The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. He saw no moral dilemma. This was a transaction, and he was on the winning end. Sarah knew she had one chance, maybe less. She had to run. But where? Redemption was 50 miles away, a 2-day walk across open country with no water, and Thomas would come after her. He wouldn't let his payment just walk away. The pony, the honey-colored mare, was her only hope. It was tied to the corral, a living symbol of her gilded cage. That afternoon she saw her opportunity. Thomas, celebrating his good fortune, had opened a bottle of his cheapest whiskey. He was slumped in his chair, his head nodding towards his chest. His breathing was heavy, regular, asleep. Moving like a ghost, Sarah slipped out the cabin door. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs. The air was cold and the sky looked like a sheet of lead. She untied the pony, its large dark eyes watching her calmly. She didn't dare risk going back inside for food or water. She just needed to get away. She swung herself onto its bare back, her skirts hiking up around her knees. She kicked the pony's side gently, urging it into a walk, then a trot, heading east, towards the rising sun, towards what she prayed was freedom. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. She rode for what felt like hours, the rhythmic motion of the horse a calming balm on her frayed nerves. The homestead disappeared behind her. The world was nothing but endless, rolling plains under a gray sky. For the first time in 2 years, a flicker of hope ignited within her. Maybe she could make it. Maybe she could disappear, start a new life somewhere. He could never find her. But the West doesn't give up its secrets or its prisoners so easily. As the afternoon light began to fade, she saw them. Not behind her, where she expected to see Thomas, but in front of her, a line of riders sitting silently on their horses, blocking her path. It was Kem's people. They had come back, but they weren't looking at her with the solemn respect of the previous night. Their faces were hard like stone, and they weren't looking for a bride. They were looking for a thief. The leader, Kiem's father, raised his hand, and one of the younger warriors trotted forward. He pointed not at Sarah, but at the pony she was riding. Then he pointed back the way she came, towards the homestead. And then he drew a finger across his throat. The message was brutally clear. They hadn't come for her. They had come for Thomas, and they thought she was his accomplice. The hope that had flickered within her was extinguished, plunged into an icy darkness. She had run from a cage, straight into a death sentence. Kim's father, whose name was Black Eagle, rode forward. His eyes were not angry. They were filled with a cold disappointment. He spoke, and this time, another warrior translated, his English rough but clear. "You ride the horse of the trade," the warrior said. "But the man who took our gifts did not honor the deal. He is a thief. We have learned this. A man in the town of Redemption told us. The man with the brand of the broken spur." Sarah stared, confused. "Broken spur? That's our brand. Thomas's brand. The man in town, a blacksmith, He told us this man, Thomas, bragged years ago of stealing horses from our people. A fine black stallion, a horse that belonged to my son's son, Black Eagle said through the translator, his voice heavy with old grief. The theft had caused a rift in their tribe. A young warrior had been blamed, wrongfully exiled. The honor of their clan had been stained for years. And then it all clicked into place. The final, terrible piece of the puzzle. When my son, Kim, was in your house, Black Eagle continued, he saw your horses in the corral. He saw the stallion, the one Thomas rides. It is older now, but it is the one. He recognized the white marking on its hoof. He told me this when he returned. The bride price? It hadn't been a bride price at all. It had been a test, a trap. They had offered Thomas immense wealth, an offer a greedy man couldn't refuse. By accepting it, he had entered into a pact with them. And by breaking that pact, which they knew he would, because a thief has no honor, he had sealed his own fate according to their laws. They weren't there to claim a bride. They were there to collect a debt of blood. Sarah's mind reeled. Thomas's hatred of the natives wasn't just casual racism. It was the fear of a criminal, terrified of his past catching up to him. Kim's presence in his house had been his worst nightmare come true. He tried to kill the boy, Sarah said, the words tumbling out. He hit me. He was going to sell me to you. Black Eagle listened, his expression unchanging. He looked at the red mark still visible on her cheek. He looked at her, alone on the plains riding the pony they had given her. He saw the truth in her eyes. He nodded slowly. You are the woman of the rifle, the translator said. My son told us of your courage. You are not with the thief. He gave an order and 2 warriors broke from the group, riding hard towards the homestead. Towards Thomas, who was likely still passed out in his chair, dreaming of his stolen wealth. Sarah knew she would never see him again. The plains would swallow him whole, another dark secret buried in the dust. Justice in the West was often swift and always final. Black Eagle looked at Sarah. The debt is paid, the translator said. The gifts are yours. They are not a price for a bride. They are a gift for a warrior. For the one who saved my son, your path is your own. You are free. Sarah sat on the honey-colored pony, the wind whipping her hair, the vast empty plains stretching out in every direction. She was alone, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the gifts of a people she had met only yesterday. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't a daughter, a wife, or a ward. She was just Sarah, free. What becomes of a woman like that? A woman forged in fear and freed by a single act of courage. Does she ride east, back to a world she no longer recognizes? Or does she ride west, into the heart of the unknown, to write a new story, a story that is entirely her own? The legend of the woman with the Winchester was just beginning. If you felt the dust of the plains and the beat of a desperate heart, then don't forget to hit that like button. Share this story with someone who loves a tale of survival and unexpected turns. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming your way. Your support helps us bring more legends like this to life. Thank you for listening.